This is a slightly unusual video for today because what we are looking at is not a canal. This is the River Ure in Yorkshire, and in fact what we're looking at here is the head of navigation. This is as far as you can get up the river. So why am I here? Well, if we turn round we can see something in the distance that's worth looking at. If you go to the head of the navigation of the River Ure and then turn left, you will see this. It is a lock. And this is the first lock on the Ripon Canal. So I suppose now is a good time to talk about what the difference between a river, a canal and a navigation is. A river is the simplest one. It is a naturally formed channel, and basically the definition is when it rains all over the whole area, and where you have hills and valleys, the water runs down the hills and into the valleys and then flows away downhill. It's called a drainage basin, and that is what a river is. It is a natural channel from a drainage basin leading either to another river or ultimately to the sea. The next step, I guess, is a navigation, and that is when people have come along to a river and they have either changed the course of the channel or simply widened and deepened the channel and put in locks and so on. So the River Thames is a navigation as well as being a river, and there are various other ones you'll hear, things called, the Arun called a navigation, and so on and so forth. Okay, and the last one is a canal, and the key feature of a canal is that it is entirely man-made. There was no channel there before. Pretty much by definition it has to go not where there is a natural drainage channel. In fact, crossing a drainage basin, i.e. going from one to another, is pretty much a feature of a canal. So this is the Ripon Canal. It is a very, very short canal, and because it only connects to the River Ure, it is more or less isolated from the rest of the canal network. It also used to be the most northerly point on the canal system. And normally in canals, when we say something used to be the most something or other, it means it's because it's closed, or it's no longer the most northerly something or other because it's shut or fallen into decay or whatever. But not this one. This used to be the most northerly one and now isn't, because they have opened the Ribble link, which links the Carnforth Canal up to the rest of the system, and therefore that has now become the most northerly point. So, not the most northerly anymore, but still rather a nice little canal. Interesting as well, have a look at it. These locks sort of scream river locks. Look at the wide footpaths across them. If you have a look at the beams, there's beam extensions on the end. The paddles are, despite being locked closed, are hydraulic paddles. This is a very river-like lock. However, if we go further up the canal towards its end, we will discover it turns more and more into a canal as we go. This is a funny old stretch of canal. It was built more or less in the middle of Canal Mania, 1770s, and it was built specifically such that they could, or they extended the Ure specifically such that they could build this canal, and they could transport stuff from Ripon down towards places like Hull and Huddersfield and York. If you go behind us, you end up on the Ouse going down to York. And it was broadly a success, at least to begin with. But eventually it closed. And when you get to canal closures, they tend to happen in two sort of tranches. One is at the end of the canal era in the late 19th century. Various canals essentially ceased to be commercially viable, so you get a whole bunch of canals closing between about 1890 and about 1920. This is one of those. It was pretty much abandoned by 1904. And then the other thing you get is in the 50s and 60s, when all the canals were nationalised, they just basically decided to actively abandon a whole bunch of them because they didn't want to maintain them, they didn't see any use for them, and they were wrong mostly. But nevertheless, a whole bunch more canals closed between the 50s and the 70s. And this is also one of them, because whilst it was basically unnavigable in 1904 onwards, it was officially abandoned in 1950. Now, I mentioned that that was in response to the nationalisation of the canals, but this canal was never nationalised. And if we have a look at a map, it's reasonably easy to see why once you know. So here is the Ripon Canal. It basically goes from where the Yure becomes unnavigable up here, and this whole navigation all the way down to where the Yure meets the Ouse was owned in its latter years by a railway company, and obviously the railway company had quite a vested interest in the canal not being profitable. In fact, they bought it specifically to neglect it, and beyond about 1890 or so, the boats were not allowed beyond Boroughbridge. So whilst the canal may have been technically open, it was definitely not actually navigable. And so when the canals were nationalised in 1948, they nationalised all the canals and rivers that were navigable, and the whole sort of shtick of the company that owned it was based on it not being navigable. So in fact it remained under the aegis of, I think it was called the Louth Navigation Authority or something, some sort of made-up company basically that existed purely to tell people that it wasn't navigable, and it remained under their authority until 1999, when it was handed over to British Waterways, and then eventually, of course, the CRT. So when the Ripon Canal Society was formed in the 1960s, with a view to making all this navigable once again, they really had to fight against essentially the owners who denied that it was basically there at all. So it makes it more impressive really that they managed to get it restored. Let's go back and have a look. And here we are at the other end of the canal, a whole mile and a half away from where we were. We were saying that the Ripon Canal Society worked pretty tirelessly to restore this canal. In fact, by 1996 this basin was open, and slightly interestingly, the Ripon Canal Society, having achieved its aim, disbanded and handed over the canal to the Canal and Rivers Trust, or British Waterways as was, now the CRT, who now administer it. And I mean, you know, if you're a boater or if you're hiring a boat in the area, it's well worth a visit. It is extremely little used. I mean, one reason being that it's incredibly remote. In order to get here, you have to go all the way up the Ouse through York. It's probably a 3-day trip from the nearest next canal, but it is worth it. It's a beautiful little point to come to. This is as far as you can go if you want to moor, but you can take your boat up into the canal basin. And one of the nice things about this canal basin, which I very much like, is the fact that most of the houses around it are original, and those that aren't, these are new builds, have been built really sympathetically in the sort of vernacular style, but not in a sort of pastiche. In other words, you can tell they're modern houses, but they are sympathetic with the style of the canal. If you don't want to come up here in a boat, because it is a 3-day trip, you can come up here and take a trip on the trip boat, which is a very pleasant way to spend an hour or two. In any case, having opened in 1776 and been broadly worked out, you know, more or less closed by about 1904, so it only had a working life of 120 odd years, and then sat fallow for 90 odd years, is now open for business again, or more likely for pleasure, and that is to be thoroughly applauded. I hope you enjoyed this little video about the Ripon Canal. Normal service will be resumed sometime next week, when we'll get back to the mainstream canal system. But it's always worth finding these interesting little, you know, sort of odds and ends of the canal system, and even more fun if you have the means to go and visit them. I'll see you next time. If you enjoy these videos, please do like and subscribe. Goodbye.